He had it all: power, wisdom, unimaginable wealth, and 1,000 wives. But in the end, he lost what was most precious: his soul. This isn't just the story of a king. It's the tragic fall of one of the brightest men in history. The wisest King Solomon's fall didn't happen overnight. It was slow, subtle, and painfully human. Get ready to dive into a journey that reveals one of the Bible's greatest paradoxes. How can someone so close to God end up so far away? This story isn't just about the past, it's about the choices many of us are still making today. Let's understand how King Solomon 1,000 wives became a symbol of ruin and what that has to teach us now. And what if I told you that your greatest blessing could become your greatest downfall if you don't stay vigilant? Solomon didn't fall because of ignorance, but because of pride disguised as wisdom. What you're about to hear might change the way you see success, power, and spirituality. Because sometimes those who have the most are the ones most at risk of being lost. Solomon wasn't born a king, but he was chosen to inherit a throne and a divine mission. As a young man, he asked for wisdom instead of riches, and that deeply pleased God. That decision made him the wisest man who ever lived, and his reign began with justice, peace, and prosperity. He judged fairly, built with purpose, and inspired an entire nation. But often, it's at the peak of wisdom that ruin begins. With fame spreading far and wide, Solomon became a living legend. Queens and kings traveled from distant lands just to hear his words and witness his glory. That popularity brought not only prestige, but also temptations. Power, luxury, and applause created fertile ground for pride. And when ego grows bigger, then humility, even divine wisdom, can be forgotten. Solomon was the architect of the temple in Jerusalem, the heart of his people's faith. A historic achievement, a symbol of his devotion to God. But the same man who once knelt in prayer began to lose himself in his own desires. History shows us that the human heart is easily corrupted when it strays from the source of wisdom. And that's where we start to see the first cracks in the perfect king's image. Solomon, single quotes S story, takes a dramatic turn when he becomes involved with 1,000 women. It wasn't just romance, it was politics, strategy, power. With each new foreign wife came a new altar, a new god. And so, the heart that was once fully devoted to the Lord began to split into fragments. Each concession seemed small, but together, they formed the beginning of a spiritual abyss. These women didn't just influence his daily life, they shaped his faith. Solomon, who once denounced idolatry, now built monuments to gods like Ashtoreth and Molech. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible to the public eye, but deafening in heaven. The wisest man in the world became an example of how excessive power can distort conscience. King Solomon 1,000 wives stopped being a historical curiosity and became a personal tragedy. Instead of guarding his heart, Solomon scattered it among 1,000 voices, 1,000 wills, 1,000 desires. And as we know, where there's too much noise, the voice of wisdom falls silent. He was still the king, still wise, but no longer the same. His identity, once built on the fear of God, was now mingled with the vanity of pagan kingdoms. It was the beginning of the end, and the end would be bitter. Idolatry didn't arrive with fanfare, but like a gentle breeze that gradually cools passion. Already swayed by the whims of his wives, Solomon allowed altars to be built for foreign gods, right near the temple of the Lord. This choice was a stab in the heart of the spiritual covenant that bound him to God. The man who had once been the highest representative of faith in Israel now shared his devotion with false gods. This wasn't just a personal fall, it impacted the entire nation. The people, following their king's example, began to normalize idolatry. The promised land became filled with strange images, pagan sacrifices, and feasts for foreign gods. King Solomon idolatry left deep scars on Israel's spiritual history. True faith was corrupted by the blending of cultures that did not fear God. The cost of that betrayal wasn't only spiritual. God's presence began to withdraw. The wisdom that once guided Solomon's decisions seemed replaced by confusion and impulsiveness. He traded intimacy with the eternal for empty applause and soulless rituals. And the most tragic part? He knew exactly what he was doing and still did it. The wisest man on earth was sinking, fully aware and in silence. Solomon's soul, once solid as a rock, was being worn down by guilt and distance from God. What was once certainty became doubt. What was faith became emptiness. He began to experience an inner anguish that not even the gold of Ophir could ease. That's the essence of Solomon's spiritual decline, a fall that isn't visible on the outside, but devastating on the inside. When writing Ecclesiastes, Solomon sounded like a man tired of his own greatness. Vanity of vanities, everything is vanity, he said, like someone who reached the top only to find it hollow. He realized that power, wisdom, and pleasure couldn't fill the void left by the absence of God. It was like trying to buy peace with coins that hold no value in heaven. This crisis didn't destroy him physically, but it consumed his soul. He was the same man, same crown, same titles, same palaces. But inside, he was a battlefield. This is one of the deepest lessons about human spirituality. We don't lose everything at once, but piece by piece. Until one day, we no longer recognize ourselves in the mirror. Solomon had everything a man could desire: wisdom, power, wealth, recognition. But it was at this peak that his morals began to fail. He hoarded gold while justice became rare. His grand architectural projects clashed with the abandonment of the very commandments he had once lived by. This is the living portrait of Solomon: power, wealth, moral failure. The issue wasn't the wealth itself, but what it came to represent. It stopped being a tool and became a throne. Solomon surrounded himself with luxury while his people endured burdens and harsh taxes. The king who had started his reign judging with righteousness was now remembered for the weight he placed on others. The temple's gold gleamed, but the king's conscience darkened. This failure wasn't just about greed, it was about forgetting where he came from. Solomon forgot the young man who humbly asked God for wisdom. And that made his downfall even more painful. The contrast between who he was and who he became marks his story as one of the Bible's most tragic. A king who had it all and lost what mattered most. The peak of Solomon's tragedy was the loss of his soul, not physically but spiritually. He became an empty man, surrounded by wisdom, yet directionless. Wrapped in wealth, yet poor in essence. The one who began his journey speaking with God in dreams now lived in divine silence. This is what it looks like when someone loses their most precious connection, intimacy with the Creator. That silence is deafening. There's no punishment harsher than not hearing God's voice anymore. Solomon wasn't overthrown by enemies or betrayed by allies. He was defeated by his own choices. Solomon lost soul isn't just a phrase, it's a warning. A call to consider how far a heart can drift, even when it knows the truth. At the end of his life, there's no record of public repentance, only bitter reflections. He left behind a legacy both powerful and painful. Ecclesiastes may be the greatest mirror of his soul. Words from a man who tasted everything and found that, without God, it's all meaningless. The wisest man in the world left us with one final lesson: wisdom without obedience leads to ruin. The cruel irony of Solomon's story is that the wisest man in the world fell in the most predictable way. He wasn't deceived by others, he was undone by himself. His journey proves that wisdom without vigilance isn't enough. What began as a life of glory ended as a warning to future generations. The wisest King Solomon's fall became a universal lesson. His fall wasn't sudden, it was gradual. Each wrong choice seemed small, until their weight became unbearable. It's like a wall collapsing stone by stone until it crumbles entirely. The king who wrote Proverbs teaching paths of life didn't follow his own advice. Wisdom without practical application becomes just a hollow echo. Solomon's ending is one of the Bible's most sorrowful chapters. He had direct access to heaven and still chose earthly shortcuts. There was no armed rebellion, no war, no assassination, just the quiet forgetting of God. Rise and Fall Solomon is more than a biography, it's a mirror. And maybe, by seeing ourselves in it, we can avoid repeating his story. Solomon's legacy isn't just in his palaces, proverbs, or the magnificent temple he built. His real legacy lies in the bitter lesson of his fall. The Bible doesn't hide his flaws, it highlights them, so they serve as a warning. Bible story Solomon Wives isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a reflection of human fragility. Solomon lived out the experiences many dream of: fame, fortune, wisdom, pleasure. But he ended with a void none of those could fill. That's the echo that still speaks today. Without God, everything is vanity. His story proves that spiritual decline doesn't start with rebellion. It begins with small, repeated compromises. And that's what makes his example so powerful. Looking back, Solomon could have been remembered only as the king who asked for wisdom. But his memory became split between glory and sorrow. It's up to us to choose which part of that legacy we'll follow. Because every fall has a beginning. And maybe, by recognizing the signs, our story can end differently than his. Now that you've seen the rise and fall of Solomon, tell me, how many times have you found yourself repeating the same patterns? Small compromises, prayerless decisions, silence where faith once spoke? Maybe your fall won't come with a loud crash, but through quiet details. And if you're not careful, you could end up like Solomon, surrounded by everything, yet empty. Inside, are you paying attention to the voices influencing your heart? What are your 1,000 wives? Those alliances, habits, or desires that seem harmless but slowly drain your faith? Maybe it's time to examine your choices. Solomon's legacy can be a tragedy, or a turning point. The choice is yours. If this story spoke to you in any way, subscribe to the Glorify Forever channel. Turn on notifications and share this video with someone who needs to reflect on the power of decisions. Here, you'll find more than just stories. You'll find truths that transform. See you in the next video.